Hello, my name is Austin Habish, the founder of Think Catholic, and you're listening to the Summa podcast, where we study St. Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologiae in a way simple and insightful for anyone to understand. The Summa podcast is brought to you by Think Catholic. Taking 2 questions of the Summa a day, we'll seek to summarize St. Thomas's responses, discovering the brilliance of Aquinas and his Catholic faith. This is day 107. So let's get started. We're covering today questions 92 and 93 of the Prima Secundae, that is, of the effects of law and of the eternal law. The translation that I always use in these podcasts is the one generously provided to me by Ave Maria Press, the 5-volume set translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican province, which you can now get at a discounted price from Ave Maria Press's site by typing in the code SUMMA10. And so here we go. Article 1, whether an effect of law is to make men good. Aristotle wrote that the intention of every lawgiver is to make good citizens. For it is good for a subordinate thing, or something ordered to another, like a man's passions are ordered to his intellect, to in fact be subordinate, or to be confirmed or aligned to that greater thing. And laws instruct a man and command him to subordinate his particular actions and goals to his ultimate goal, which is happiness. That is the intention of law, to promote and protect the common good, the good which all commonly pursue, which, as we mentioned in the last episode, is ultimately happiness. Laws make men good by instructing them in the way of happiness as individual and as a member of a society. It can also, by then giving him the opportunity to be obedient to that law, these dictates of reason, allow him the opportunity to grow in virtue. Thus, by instructing a man in the path to his ultimate good, and by allowing him to practice and grow in virtue by conforming himself to that path, these ordinances of reason, law, have the effect of making a man good. Article 2, whether the acts of law are suitably assigned. Acts here meant to mean something like functions. What does the law do? It permits, it forbids, it punishes, and it commands. And these 4 categories are suitably enumerated because law concerns human actions, and human acts can be of 3 kinds, either categorically evil, like adultery, categorically good, like almsgiving, or categorically indifferent, like taking engineering as a profession. Therefore, the law can command that its citizens act justly, it can forbid and punish evil deeds, such as murder, and it can permit whatever happens to be generically, morally indifferent, like again becoming an attorney or a doctor. Pretty straightforward, and so with that we move on to question 93 on the eternal law. Having discussed law in general, now we will devote an entire question to each type of law, beginning here with the eternal law. Article 1, what is the eternal law? As defined by St. Augustine, the eternal law is the sovereign type by which we must always conform. By type, we mean something like prototype or model, would probably be even better. That just like a man before building a table has the idea of that built table in his mind, has a kind of model or type before he goes out and builds that table outside of his mind, so too God has in his mind what everything is, its nature, even before he brings that nature into actual existence outside of his mind, as well as wherein its perfection lies, along with the means for this thing to attain its perfection. This is the eternal law, or eternal rule, concerning most especially what a thing is, what it is made for, and how it is to get there. Which is why, as an example, when someone uses their reproductive faculties for intrinsically non-reproductive acts, which is in vogue today, not only do they act inhumanely or contrary to the kind of thing that they are, contrary to the purpose of these faculties, but they also act against the eternal law, because what they are, their nature is not random or from nowhere, but was made in a very intentional way by their Creator. And along with it comes a specific means to their perfection, to their happiness, which they diminish the possibility of attaining when one acts against the kind of thing that they are. St. Thomas's response to our article is in the following words: just as in every craftsman there pre-exists a type of the things that are made by his art, so too in every governor there must pre-exist the type of the order of those things that are to be done by those who are subject to his government. And just as the type of the things yet to be made by an art is called the exemplar of the creations of that art, so too the type in him who governs the acts of his subjects bears the character of a law. Article 2, whether the eternal law is known to all, which is a question we are right to ask because, again, for a law to be a law, according to St. Thomas's definition of it, it must be promulgated. So is the eternal law promulgated to all, and how? St. Augustine says, the knowledge of the eternal law is imprinted on us. And how this is the case, St. Thomas writes, all men know the truth to a certain extent, at least as to the common principles of the natural law, and as to the others they partake of the knowledge of truth, some more, some less, and in this respect are more or less cognizant of the eternal law. So as we mentioned in the last episode, the eternal law as accessible by our natural powers we term the natural law. These laws are apparent to us in such a way as to make those who break them culpable for that breach. An easy example of breaking the natural law would be taking the life of an innocent person, which one knows is wrong via common sense or via being rational. Abortion would be an even more specific example of that law. These break the natural law, and by transgressing the natural law, they also break the eternal law upon which they stand and found their origin. Article 3, whether every law is derived from the eternal law, which is a nuanced question. So beginning with St. Thomas, he writes, human law has the nature of law insofar as it partakes of right reason, and it is clear that in this respect it is derived from the eternal law. But insofar as it deviates from reason, it is called an unjust law and has the nature not of law but of violence. Nevertheless, even an unjust law, insofar as it retains some appearance of law through being framed by one who is in power, is derived from the eternal law, since all power is from the Lord God, according to Romans chapter 13, which is a great summary response to this article's question. Since there is one uncreated truth, i.e. God, anything else that is true, including any laws in accordance with right reason, can be said to be derived from God, derived from the eternal law. However, even if some ruler enacts unjust laws, still his authority to enact laws is just and stems from man's nature as a social animal, making the formation of cities and states natural to man, and thereby that ruler is endowed in a certain way with divinely appointed rights, which is why it is appropriate for St. Thomas to cite Romans chapter 13, which deals with this point precisely. So, ending this article with that chapter, St. Paul says in Romans chapter 13, let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, he who resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of him who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval, for he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. He is the servant of God to execute his wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore, one must be subject not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. For the same reason, you also pay taxes, for the authorities are ministers of God, attending to this very thing. Pay all of them their dues, taxes to whom taxes are due, revenue to whom revenue is due, respect to whom respect is due, honor to whom honor is due. Article 4, whether necessary and eternal things are subject to the eternal law. Is the stone falling when I release it from my hand, or the eternal truth that 2 things plus 2 other things equals 4 things total, subject to the eternal law. In a word from St. Thomas, accordingly, all that is in things created by God, whether it be contingent or necessary, is subject to the eternal law, while things pertaining to the divine nature or essence are not subject to the eternal law, but are the eternal law itself. Therefore, our response to this article is in the affirmative. Even necessary and eternal things are subject to the eternal law as well. Article 5, whether natural contingents are subject to the eternal law, are irrational created things subject to the eternal law. And they are not subject to the law in the sense that they understand the law that they are subject to as law and then voluntarily subject themselves to it, but they do have a God-given nature, end, and means to that end, which having all come through the knowledge and will of God, then they can be said to be subject to the eternal law. In Aquinas' words, God imprints on the whole of nature the principles of its proper actions. And so, in this way, God is said to command the whole of nature. And thus all actions and movements of the whole of nature are subject to the eternal law. Consequently, irrational creatures are subject to the eternal law through being moved by divine providence, but not as rational creatures are through understanding the divine commandment. Article 6, and our last article, whether all human affairs are subject to the eternal law. And the best way to begin this article is with a few sentences from St. Thomas and then a brief explanation to follow. Beginning with Aquinas, he says, "In the wicked, in them the natural inclination of virtue is corrupted by vicious habits, and moreover the natural knowledge of good is darkened by passions and habits of sin. But in the good both are found more perfect, because in them, besides the natural knowledge of good, there is the added knowledge of faith and wisdom. And again, besides the natural inclination to good, there is the added motive of grace and virtue." So in response to our article, it is true that all human affairs are subject to the eternal law in the sense that everything we do for the sake of happiness, we do for the sake of attaining some good, and since that pursuit has been placed in us by God, then in this way all human actions can be said to follow the eternal law. The wicked, as confused to the true good by passion or vice or culpable ignorance, do not follow this law perfectly, while the righteous follow it supernaturally perfectly through the interior workings of grace and virtue, which is what our citation from St. Thomas is seeking to articulate. All human affairs are subject to the eternal law, yet fulfilled differently between the righteous and the unrighteous. And that is all for questions 92 and 93 of the Prima Secundae, that is, of the effects of law and of the eternal law. My name is Austin Habish with Think Catholic, and I cannot wait to see you tomorrow.